Chapter 4. Apple Blossoms. Mamma, Snow White asked as she, Verona, and the Queen stepped into the carriage that would deliver them to the festival, is it almost time for the leaves to change? Yes, dear, the Queen replied. Snow White looked puzzled. But don't the apple blossoms come out after winter? The Queen smiled. Most do, little bird, but the apple blossoms in Apple Blossom Meadow are different. No one knows for sure why they bloom in the autumn. But some say that long ago a young girl lost her way in the forest. It was late in the year, near the winter solstice, and the girl was cold, frightened, and hungry. She huddled beneath a stand of apple trees in the wood, and by some strange magic, the air around her became warmer, and the trees blossomed and bore fruit. The child was warm and fed throughout the entire winter, and when the springtime came, she was found by her overjoyed parents, who thought they had lost her to the cold and the frost. Snow White thought about this for a moment, and then she sat back in the carriage and smiled. I wouldn't want to be apart from you and Papa, Mamma, but I do love apples, and it would be so nice to eat them for an entire winter. The Queen and Verona looked at each other and smiled at the child's innocence. The Queen then looked outside the carriage to notice much fanfare and anticipation in advance of her arrival. She felt guilty for not giving the villagers proper notice of her attendance. After all, she had announced that she would be attending the festival only 2 days prior. She customarily would not thrust herself upon them with so little notice, but she was desperate for a respite from the gloom of the castle. It seemed, however, that her lack of advance notice didn't quell the villagers' excitement, and as the three beauties exited the carriage, a mass of subjects with apple blossoms in hand cheered on the queen and her party. Petals floated in the air dreamily, settling around, over, and on them. The queen noticed how striking the light pink petals looked in Snow's dark hair, and noted to herself that she would have a dress of the lightest pink made for Snow. She smiled at her subjects and then took her seat to watch the festivities. Snow munched on tarts as she looked at the many pretty young girls presenting themselves before the queen in hopes of becoming this year's apple blossom maiden. You're prettier than any of those girls, Mamma, don't you think, Verona? Snow asked. But Verona was distracted by a message that had just been delivered to her by a young porter. The queen noticed the letter in Verona's hands and leaned over to ask her what it said. Verona folded the letter. Then her face brightened. She whispered to the queen, My lady, the king will be home this evening. Will he? We have so much to prepare before he arrives. The queen wanted to rush back to the castle that very moment, but she had committed to this event and she would not let Snow or the people of the kingdom down. Send a letter back with a porter to the other servants, the queen whispered to Verona. Tell them I wish to make the grandest holiday of the king's return. And as the Apple Blossom Festival wound down and the Apple Blossom Maiden was chosen, it was all the queen could do to keep her mind off her husband's return. She decided that she would arrange a magnificent feast of roasted pig, her husband's favorite, and for herself and Snow, pheasant and wine sauce with wild mushrooms. The table would sag under the weight of the platters of exquisite candied pears, glazed apricots, roasted red potatoes with rosemary, and jugs of warm spiced cider and wine. Everyone in the castle would eat well in celebration of the king's return. The queen, unable to contain the good news any longer, told Snow of her father's return during their carriage ride home. And when they arrived back at the castle, the great hall was already filled with glowing candles, warm fires, and friendly conversation. Snow hurried upstairs with Verona to clean up and dress for her father's arrival. The queen, for her part, did the same, frantically scouring and perfuming herself, painting her face, doing up her hair, and all the while she wore a brilliant smile. When she arrived at the court, Snow was already there. She looked so small and delicate, sitting in her high-backed chair in this great hall. Before the preparations had been completed, before the queen could take her seat, there was a blare of horns. Snow knew what this meant, and she launched from her seat and ran toward the castle entrance. The queen followed, her speed restricted by her formal gown. The king burst into the hall. So how have my beauties been occupying their time while I've been away? He asked. A great cheer erupted in the castle. Snow leaped into his arms, and he twirled the child around and kissed her. He had returned from the battlegrounds a different man. The queen noticed a scar above his right cheek. His hair was not as groomed as it normally would be, and his beard had grown rough and ragged. And it was not only his physical appearance that had changed. His eyes were weighed down with sorrow and confusion, perhaps regret. Still, underneath, the queen could see the bright blue sparkle that she so dearly loved. An emotion the queen had never before felt welled up inside her. It was something she couldn't explain, something between deep sadness and sheer ecstasy. Her lip began to quiver, and she could feel the pressure of tears weighing on her eyes. She ran to the king and embraced him and the child. "I've missed you so much," she said. Mamma crowned the apple blossom maiden. "Oh, Papa, she looks so beautiful with apple blossoms in her hair." "Was the maiden that beautiful then?" the king asked. Snow made a sour face as if her father should have known she was talking about her mother and not the apple blossom maiden. "I meant Mamma. She was the prettiest girl there. She should have been the apple blossom maiden." "Oh, I'm sure she was the most beautiful. It sounds as if you had lovely days without me, my dears. I'm sorry I missed them." "That's okay, Papa. But I have had a thought. If you should make friends with dragons, Papa, then you would be able to fly home more quickly, or maybe you could even learn to turn into a dragon, like the lady from Mama's tale." The king and queen laughed at their daughter's sweet words and then joined their guests who had already begun to celebrate. Then suddenly an explosion rocked the castle. Screams of terror erupted from the banquet hall, and attendants scurried to find safety in any corner of the hall that looked clear. "Snow White!" the queen called out, unable to find the child in the panicked crowd or through the thick smoke that was filling the room. "Snow!" Battle cries went up from the men who had so recently returned, and they were uncannily suited and armed quicker than any man could dress himself for an ordinary day. The queen was confounded. What was happening? At once the great wooden door of the hall came crashing down. The queen screamed out, terrified of what was happening. "Snow White!" she screamed again, but the child did not answer. Men on horseback dressed in royal blue stormed the hall, but the king's men appeared to be holding them off for now. Then the queen felt a strong hand grab at her arm and pull her away. She gasped, then turned to see who had grasped her. The king, and he was holding a terrified Snow White in his arms. "Come," he said. The queen felt faint but followed as best she could. "Who are they?" she asked her husband as he led her down one of the castle halls where men continued to suit up for battle. "The opposing army from our most recent battle. They must have followed us back home. I am sorry to have put you and Snow White in danger this way." Snow continued to shake and kept her head buried in her father's shoulder, looking up occasionally to see if the men were still attacking, if smoke was still filling the halls. Shouts and battle cries echoed through the castle. As the king unlatched the dungeon door, he grabbed a torch and quickly ushered the queen and Snow down a spiral staircase. The dungeon was damp and cold, and in the darkness, the queen had difficulty finding her footing. The king felt around the floor of the dungeon and located a trapdoor. "Take this torch," he told the queen. "Descend these stairs, and at the bottom you will find a small rowboat that will carry you out of the castle and to safety." "You will be joining us," the queen said. "I will protect you in the way I know best. Now take Snow and go," the king responded, and then he ran out from the dungeon once more. The queen held the shaking child close, and she made her way to the boat that the king promised would be waiting. The queen set the torch in the brace on the boat and boarded. Snow White clung to her, and the queen found it difficult to row the boat and hold the child at the same time, but she had to, and she did. Soon the boat was drifting out the castle and down a small river into the marshland that surrounded the castle. A blast of cold air hit them, and the queen held Snow White close. The queen rowed the boat into an area that was densely covered with swamp grass, and the two sat shivering among the plants as the sky lit up red and orange around them. Both the queen and the child started each time a blast sounded. "Mama, is Papa going to be okay?" Snow asked through shivering teeth. "He always is he not?" But the queen was not sure herself what would come of this night. Soon the blast subsided, and the land around the castle fell silent. The queen wrapped her cape around herself and the child for warmth. Snow White drifted off to sleep, and the queen stayed awake all night holding vigil, and then she felt a hand on her shoulder. The king. "Come, my loves," he said, and they waded through the frosty swampland and made their way back to the castle. The halls looked a wreck, but the castle had held up well. The king told the queen that they had fought off the invaders. "Will they be back?" she asked. "No," the king said confidently. "Your Majesty," a voice called from the far end of the hall. "Verona, the queen replied, and the two women approached each other and embraced. I'm so happy to see you well, Verona said. And I you, the queen replied. We suffered no casualties, none. Your husband is a fair king and warrior. The king dropped his gaze to the ground. Come now to our chamber to rest, the king said. Verona, please take Snow White to her room and tend to her there. Yes, Majesty, Verona replied. The queen and king made their way to their chamber. The queen could not stomach the smell of burning wood and sulphur that permeated the castle. But once she had returned to her room, the air blowing in from the grounds helped dampen the stench. And then she noticed something far more terrible than anything that had happened the night before. Sitting there on the mantel was the mirror she had broken, now fully repaired and intact. But how? She was not able to pull her eyes away from it. She became disoriented with confusion and terror. Verona wrote to inform me of the broken mirror. I was deeply saddened, so I set the kingdom's finest craftsmen to the task of repairing it. Of course, even their powers pale in comparison to your father's. I meant to surprise you with its origin on our wedding day, dear heart. I thought you would like something to remind you of your father. It is his handiwork. Surely you have recognized it by now. The queen struggled to find her voice, to make it pleasant and not full of the terror that seized her. Thank you, my darling. You are thoughtful. She kissed her husband and tried to banish all fear from her heart. I'm so happy you're home, my love, she said. The king dropped his eyes. You're leaving again, aren't you? He nodded. You can't. Not so soon. You saw what happened last evening. The invading kingdoms might topple us at any moment if we don't drive them back. I would rather meet them away from here, where they can't harm you. I must keep you and Snow, all of us, safe. Keep us safe here, the queen shouted. My men will do that, replied the king. You have been gone so long, I fear I may be losing my mind. His heart was clearly breaking. No, my love, you are simply tired and weary. The queen wanted so much to share what she had seen in the mirror with her husband, but he would think her mad, or worse, possessed by evil spirits. Still, it seemed to be the only option if she were to convince him to remain in the castle. I saw a man's face in that mirror you gave me, my love. He spoke to me. Oh, my darling, the king said, appearing to be concerned for her sanity. Don't look at me that way. If you were not gone so often, I would not be plagued with such visions, she said, paralyzed with panic. You are not going mad, my love. You are simply exhausted. You are the strongest woman I know, but even you have your limits. I want you to rest tomorrow. I will spend the day with Snow, and then you and I will have the evening to ourselves. I'm sorry, my love. I shouldn't have blamed you. Please put this out of your mind, my dear. I promise you all will be well, the queen said. The king held the queen tightly, and she broke down weeping in his arms. She was comforted there, and imagined that this is how a child must feel when she is being protected by her parent. Then the great queen fell asleep in the king's arms, sobbing.